Welcome to the final introductory lecture of this semester. This is on St. Augustine. So this is a culminating figure in our exploration of the ancient world, where we then pivot to the medieval, and that will be the subject of our next semester. St. Augustine was born in 354 and he died in 430. This is a time of momentous change in the Roman Empire, when at the birth of Augustine, the majority of the Roman Empire was probably still pagan. By the time he died, the majority would have been Christian. That's a very significant change. And also by the time he died as the Germanic tribe, the Vandals, were besieging his see, his episcopal see at Hippo Regius on the coast of North Africa, and that presages the fact that within a few decades, the last Roman emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, in 476, would be deposed by a barbarian. A convenient way of marking the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The empire in the East would go on for several more centuries, and that's another story that's relevant here. We ended our last discussion with Marcus Aurelius at the end of the 2nd century. A lot of factors are coming into play, especially demographic ones, but also having to do with the inherent deficiencies of the imperial succession, the system, the basis that it had in military approbation. And that leads to the crisis of the 3rd century, in which you have dozens of emperors and claimants on the imperial throne succeeding each other within often weeks or months of each other. Before that, the disaster really gets into motion, though. The Emperor Caracalla in 212 extends Roman citizenship to every freedman in the empire. That is a very interesting notion, that this city, this civitas, this polis, Rome, which was the nucleus of an empire under the Republic and then under these emperors, is now claiming as its own people in North Africa, in the Near East, on the Danube, as Romans, right? They have the name of this city. And that's something for us to think about, that Romanitas wasn't something that was being limited to this one location, Rome. It was that everyone in the empire, every male especially, who was free, is a Roman. This notion of trying to bring this particular city having a universal, as it were, extent, that's something that you try to hear when you hear the word Roman Catholic, so that there's that survival there. And that's relevant because, of course, much of the Catholic hierarchy, the structure of the ecclesiastical structure, derives from the way the Roman Empire was administratively divvied up. Okay, so the crisis of the 3rd century was brought to a close basically by Diocletian, who, through administrative genius, set up what we call the tetrarchic system in 293, where he had an emperor in Augustus in the east, in the west, along with a Caesar, a junior emperor under each of those. So you had 4 emperors. This presaged the fact that the empire would be definitively split between, though one state still would be split into west and east a century later in 395. Theodosius would be the last emperor presiding over a unified Roman Empire. Okay, in between we have Constantine, who, the way we count imperial dates is from their being acclaimed by their soldiers, right? Because that's very true, that all that power depends on the military. 306 to 337, we have the reign of Constantine, who had to defeat rivals, especially Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312, and that was preceded by Constantine's taking on a loyalty to Christianity. The next year, he issues the Edict of Milan, and that makes Christianity a tolerated religion. And that's the end, basically, of persecution of Christianity. So, on the one hand, there are massive changes happening in the empire, But there's also massive changes happening in Christianity, which has been going along, of course, for these 3 centuries. Up until that time, so much of the spiritual authority in the church came from those who were willing to give up their lives in witness to the faith, the martyrs. Once the persecutions end, it's no longer a persecuted church, and now one has to deal with the question of Christians who may not be so committed to Christianity, because maybe it's becoming more and more socially acceptable. And in fact, through the 300s, as the balance shifts, right, from maybe 10% of the empire when Constantine takes over, so he's not doing it out of a sheer calculation, because only maybe 10% of the population was Christian when he converted. As the century goes on, the balance starts to shift, and then by the end of the century, you have a majority of Christians. And in fact, towards the end of the century, probably most of the pagan cults were outlawed by the end of the 300s. And in fact, paganism has gone from being the preferred religiosity to being dispreferred. Christianity goes from being dispreferred to being preferred. So if you want an office, a preferment, being Christian at the end of the century was the way to go. So now you have to deal with the fact of lukewarm Christians who aren't really committed to the faith, but in fact are doing it because they're on the make. And one of the ways of dealing with this it was to have a shift from the confessors of the faith being martyrs to a monastic movement. And here we have the great, for instance, St. Anthony of the Desert in Egypt, who is at the source of this very interesting institution, which has had such a massive effect in the West and the East too, but the monastic system. And in fact, the life of St. Anthony will be part of what motivates Augustine to convert to Christianity. And the witness to that given by St. Athanasius in his Life of St. Anthony. Okay, so this Western and Eastern division, which was necessary, part of the problem with empires is, of course, at a certain point they become too unwieldy to administer. They collapse under their own weight. The division after Theodosius' death, Emperor Theodosius died in, I think, 394. At his passing, the empire is split. The Western capital moves around and is at Milan by the time Augustine is flourishing. It moved north of Rome because the emperors in the West wanted to be close to the frontiers where they had to go battle the Germanic tribes. Eventually it would settle in Ravenna before the fall of the West. Of course, the Eastern Empire had its capital in Constantinople. So Constantine himself moved things to the east, the Nova Roma, the New Rome, and that was the capital of the East till the end. The Roman elites, up until that time, there had been a Greco-Roman culture. We've talked about this before. And in theory, the elites were bilingual. They spoke both Greek and Roman and Latin. But with the split, the monolingualism started to settle in. The West became exclusively Latin. Augustine famously reports how he couldn't master Greek. That may have had a lot to do with the brutality of his Greek teacher, but in any case, and in the East, Latin started to be forgotten. So that's the breakdown in some real way of the Greco-Roman synthesis, in some way. The East was more urbanized, it was wealthier, it was still more culturally sophisticated, and it was more Christianized. So, ironically, when Constantine becomes Christian, he's shifting power eastward, and of course he does that literally by taking himself and senators to Constantinople. That leaves the West in need of a way to make sense of the disorders that are surrounding it. And so how are you going to stand to Christianity? How are you going to stand to paganism? When Constantine takes over, becomes a Christian, he calls an ecumenical council at the first one at Nicaea in 325. And that begins that history of this delicate dance between imperial power and episcopal power. There would be another ecumenical council during St. Augustine's lifetime. That would be First Constantinople in 381. The century is the century of the Arian controversy, where the question was, is Jesus fully God, or is he the first creature, as Arius claimed? And the Nicene orthodoxy of Jesus' full divinity was definitively established at Constantinople I. Okay, so that's all going on while Augustine is living out his life, and he sees the sack of Rome, or he lives through the sack of Rome in 410. He's back in North Africa, but here's the question about, here the whole Roman Empire is filled with Romans. The capital is no longer at Rome, but the sack of Rome by the Visigoths, this Germanic tribe, in 410 is a devastating blow to the psychology of the whole empire. The eternal city was breached, and this exposed the fact that everybody thought Rome would last forever, or that many Romans thought that this was the final political disposition. Augustine writes the City of God to kind of deal with that, try to make clear, in fact, that there is no way to make an earthly reality stick like that. That in fact we have to look for a transcendent source of order. And so this question we've been looking at all semester long, right? What is the locus of civilizational order? Is it the city, the polis, the civitas, right? That word, civitas, is the source of civilization. We talked about the first cities in Sumer, right? The civilizational dynamism, the conversation that begins there. Empire sweeps in, brings many cities together. Is that the source of order? Is it the city of Rome? Is it the Roman Empire? Is it, as the moderns might say, the nation state, which is a modern invention? Or is it the individual soul in dialogue with a transcendent ground? That would be the answer of most philosophy, as that emerged, of many of these trans-mythological religions, including Christianity. And of course, in the Confessions of Augustine, that's what you see, is this dialogue, this intense dialogue, this prayerful dialogue between the individual soul and the transcendent ground. In that sense, not anti-philosophical at all, definitely taking up the Greco-Roman heritage of the philosophical revolution. But on the other hand, if we opt for saying order in history comes from the order of the soul in relation to the transcendent ground of order, what do we do with the desire for all of us to live as one human family, a universal solidarity? That's that great tension. Can we have an intense personalization, an inwardness that's true to how irreplaceable each human being is, and yet, on the other hand, have a common life that doesn't stifle that individuality? How do we balance the person and the whole? So that's something just we've been dealing with all through the semester. And as we turn to Augustine's life in particular, we want to keep this in mind, because his life is dramatic. We know it's dramatic because we get to read this. He basically invents autobiography as we know it, in the Confessions. He's giving an account from midlife of his years leading up to conversion. So he's writing it later, and he's not giving us daily details of life as you would get in a modern autobiography, a memoir. He's giving us the history of his soul, right? His heart, his loves. All right, so he was born in a North African town, Tagaste, which is Sugaris in Algeria now, on the Numidian highlands. And this was 200 miles away from the sea. But in fact, all of that high plain of Algeria was very cultivated at that time. This was the granary of Rome. There were fields and fields of grain. It was very prosperous, though it was shifting at the time Augustine was born. He was born into a not a wealthy family, though a family that belonged to the local upper class. His father, Patricianus, was a pagan. His mother, Monica, was famously a Christian. So that tensions and the changes of the empire were telescoped into this home. The family made sacrifices in order to make it possible for Augustine to get a very fine education in Carthage, also with the help of a local patron, Romanianus. He ended up becoming a teacher of rhetoric at Carthage. He had a concubine, and they had a son, Deodatus. So it's very important to remember about St. Augustine that he was a father. Deodatus lived about 16 years and then died, and this is one of I think something one has to remember about Augustine. At the age of 19, Augustine read Cicero's Hortensius. We don't have this work, unfortunately, and that helped convert him to philosophy, kind of. Along with Virgil's Aeneid, Terence's plays, and Sallust's history, the works of Cicero were basic school texts. So he had that education. He went on to convert to Manichaeism for a few years. Mani was a prophet from the 3rd century from the Persian world, a Parthian, who preached a stronger form of dualism than you found in that native Zoroastrianism there, where matter was allied to this evil principle, always at war with the spiritual principle of goodness, and that was the account for evil. Why is there evil in the world? Because there are these irreducible principles of good and evil. Augustine was always concerned about evil. This was a question that anguished him. So if he couldn't deal with the Christian answer, partly because the Christian scriptures seemed so, and translated into Latin, the Latin version he had, it was so unpolished, and it didn't make sense in so many places. So Manichaeism met some of those concerns. He went to Rome to try to make it to the big leagues as far as teaching rhetoric. He had a set up shop there in 383. There, the famous pagan Symmachus patronized him and got him, who was the prefect of the city, he got him a position in Milan. And there, Augustine, the next year, met Bishop Ambrose, who was a master of rhetoric and was basically there for the emperor's bishop, because the emperor resided in Milan. Ambrose helped to make Christianity seem plausible, make Scripture seem as if something that could be taken seriously through allegory, for instance, through more subtle reading of the words. Okay, so eventually he converts in 386 at the age of 31. He, again, hearing about the life of St. Anthony, but also he gets this mystical moment in a garden in Milan, where he hears the voice, a child's voice somewhere saying, "Tolle, lege," take and read. And he does this thing, kind of a sortition. He's just flipping, he lets the pages of Scripture fall to a passage to let that communicate him to what he should do. And he finds a passage in Romans 13, not in drunkenness, not in wantonness, not in envy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh and the lusts thereof. And that was it. He finally makes the jump to Christianity. He gets baptized by Ambrose. He and Deodatus get baptized by Ambrose in the next year. He goes back to North Africa, to Gasta, but he visits Hippo, a seaport in North Africa at that point, and gets kind of roped into, forced to becoming a priest in 391. He's made bishop in 395 with Hippo Regius, and a couple of years later he starts to write he writes the Confessions. So he's looking back from that point and describing his life leading up to the conversion. And that's I hope a good enough background here. I want us to think as we read this passage, the book 7 from the Confessions, does my personal quest for meaning have significance for others? This part of it, we can just think, when I'm talking to myself, that interior dialogue, is it addressed to anyone? Am I just talking to myself? But also, when we're actually talking to other people, does that conversation that we're having, trying to make sense of things, does that quest for meaning have significance? Should we think of it as having meaning for other people, for the world, for the course of history? The political philosopher Eric Voegelin talks about the Ecumenic Age as that age that covers most of what we've talked about in this semester, the rise of the Persian Empire, the first multi-civilizational empire that erupts out of the ancient Mesopotamian lands in the Near East where we started. And it ends, according to Augustine, the oikumene, the ecumene, is the ancient Greek geographical word for the inhabited world, right? So this whole, that the empires all try to take over, to unite the whole of humanity under one political entity. This Ecumenic Age ends, according to Vogelin, with the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And so we see the whole sweep of the thing. And the question is, for us, the question that anguished so many people for all these centuries while all of this history was going on as empire succeeded empire. How do I make sense of the pageant of power and its futility? How do I find order when there's so much chaos? How do I make sense of life for myself? How do I make sense of a common life? How is there a vision that we can all share? And that's what I think St. Augustine is so good at helping us to feel as we pivot into a world that is no longer classical, into the medieval world, where things now shift to Christianity, and the classical inheritance has to be reaffirmed under different conditions. We want to ask ourselves, this conversation that goes on in my heart, in my mind, with others, how should I live? And when I'm talking with others, how should we live? The source of personal order, the source of common order. That's the conversation, the great conversation that makes civilization possible, that constitutes, in fact, the very process of civilization. And I hope you found this semester a rewarding journey of the Spirit, and we look forward to continuing the conversation as it heads into this new arena of the medieval world.